This building was once called the Leura Literary Institute. It was basically a library and school of arts, and in 1916 it held 650 books. But it didn't flourish, and by the 1920s it had closed. However, even though the Leura Literary Institute struggled, Leura itself has always been a bit of a literary hotspot. For a start, we have Megalong Books, the most fantastic independent bookshop. Also, every couple of weeks at the CWA Hall, a local market usually stocks a very generous supply of books. And even at the weekly Baptist Church jumble sale, there's no shortage of books, all very cheap and alphabetically arranged for your comfort. Even more interesting is the fact that so many writers have come to live here over the years, probably because it was cheap and pretty. It's not so cheap anymore, but it's still very pretty. As a writer, I find it very inspiring to walk around Leura, and if I really want some inspiration, I tend to start at the top of Balmoral Road. If you head towards the escarpment, on your left, you'll come across Ethel Turner's old holiday home. Ethel was the famous author of Seven Little Australians, a children's classic, which was about 7 rambunctious siblings whose standoffish father sends the cheekiest one, Judy, off to a Blue Mountains boarding school as punishment. She runs away, of course, and has to walk for a week to get home. Nowadays, it takes 90 minutes by car. Legend has it that these 7 big pines in front were planted in honour of the book. And I believe the legend because Ethel planted 7 trees in front of her Linfield house as well. And you can see the current occupants have left us with Ethel Turner's street library. A nice selection here. Oops. And the secret history. Won't take anything now because I don't have the hands to carry them. And I haven't brought one with me to replace. Balmoral Road is one of the poshest streets in Leura, partly because at the other end of it is a wonderful mansion called Leura, which was built just before the First World War. This is the rear gate of Leura, and the front entrance is all the way down the block and around the corner. Leura was once the home of Clive Evatt, a very prominent barrister and politician, and for years and years his descendants ran a toy and railway museum in this building, but unfortunately it closed recently and its contents were auctioned. I think it's wonderful that a fabulous collection of children's toys from as far back as the 18th century was just up the road from Ethel Turner's house. If you walk up the street and around the corner into Leura Mall, you eventually come to a house that used to belong to Kate Llewellyn. Kate is probably best known as a poet, but she also wrote 3 journals from the 80s and 90s that were set in this house in Leura. The first journal was published as The Water Lily, and I've read this book over and over again because it reflects my life so much. It's mostly about writing and gardening, very peaceful. There were also 2 sequels, Dear You and Burning. Dear You is described as a novel on the cover, but it's very heavily based on her journals, I think. I remember she described planting these 3 cherry trees out the front of her house in one of her books. And right next door is a house that was built by Herbert Evatt and his wife Mary Alice Sheffer. Herbert was the brother of Clive Evatt, who lived in Leura around the corner. And Herbert was also a judge and a politician, and at one point, President of the United Nations General Assembly. And he was also a writer. He published 5 non-fiction books, mostly histories and biographies. His wife was an artist who very early on began to buy works by people like Matisse, and she was a friend of Margaret Connolly, and she met Picasso, and she ended up the first woman appointed to the Board of Trustees of the Art Gallery of New South Wales. It's amazing that such illustrious people lived in such a modest-looking house. I'm pretty sure that the house next door, which is fairly new, was built on part of the Evatt's old garden. You can tell by the plantings and the rough fence. Just a few streets away is the house that used to belong to Mary Moody, a journalist and former presenter on the TV show Gardening Australia. She wrote a whole bunch of memoirs. The first one was Au revoir, and there are sequels including Last Tango in Toulouse and The Long Hot Summer. They're mostly set in France, but she mentions the Blue Mountains a lot, and I really enjoy her writing. You can tell she was a red-hot gardener just because of the plantings out the front of her house on the nature strip. The last writer I'm going to talk about lived in a very different part of Leura, on the northern side of the highway, in a place where the council laid out a bunch of roads about 100 years ago, but never sealed them or supplied any real services. So a few people built shacks out there, most of which have fallen down, and a lot of the roads are pretty overgrown these days. One of the shacks belonged to Eve Langley. The site has been roped off because of asbestos fears, but you can just see the old front path leading to the old fireplace. Apparently the fireplace was part of a shack that had a bus attached. Eve Langley wrote a lot of books, but only 2 of them were published. The Pea Pickers came out in 1942. It's an account of 2 sisters who dressed in men's clothes and assumed men's names to do agricultural work in Victoria in the 1920s, which is what even her sister actually did. White Topee is a kind of follow-up. It was published in 1954. In the years between those 2 publications, Eve had a terrible time. Her first child died, and then she married a drinker, and he eventually had her committed to a New Zealand mental hospital for 7 years. Eventually she divorced him and ended up living in this shack and dressing in trousers again and changing her name to Oscar Wilde by deed poll. And she died in 1974, but since her body wasn't found for 3 weeks, no one quite knows how. It's a very sad story. She's supposed to be buried in the Anglican section of Katoomba Cemetery. I've looked for her grave there, but I haven't been able to find it.